Well, good evening, Forest Mill. So glad that you could have chosen to be with us tonight for our time of Bible study. We have entered into the new year. This is the first Wednesday of 2021, which is just hard to believe how long and yet how quickly 2020 passed before us. And now here we are at the beginning of 2021, praying for a better year, for some return of health and some normalcy, for things to settle down, both in our health and the pandemic, for political tensions to ease, and certainly today has been a difficult day on that front. If you haven't been joining with us on these Wednesday evening Bible studies, we've been studying through the Psalms, not hitting all of them, but many of them. And tonight we've come to last week, or 3 weeks ago, we didn't have one the Wednesday before Christmas or the Wednesday before New Year's, but it was Psalm 100. It's a beautiful psalm. And tonight we are going on to Psalm 101, which we might call Leadership 101. We believe it was written by King David very early in his kingship. Now, if you go back and look historically, David did not inherit an entirely healthy kingdom. In fact, the kingdom was deeply divided. It was shortly after, of course, the reign of King Saul, and things had not gone particularly well under Saul's reign. And when David was anointed king, first at Hebron and then later at Jerusalem, it was a low point for the life of the Israelites, for the nation of Israel. In fact, it was described by Asaph in Psalm 78, which we read and looked at briefly there. But people's, not just the national life, but their spiritual lives were at a very low ebb. Everything rises and falls on the face and on the back of leadership. And that was certainly true of the nation of Israel, even as it is true of our own nation. We rise and fall based on the integrity and spirituality and faithfulness and righteousness of those who lead us. And certainly no one can take the credit for all the good in our nation, and no one can be blamed for all of the evils that dwell in our land. But certainly we could say that leadership has an influence on both of those. Many of King Saul's officers who were still in office when David took over, they were, we might use the word toady to describe them. They were flatterers of King Saul. And so when David took office, they weren't able to work with him. Because once David was established on the throne in Jerusalem, he had this consuming desire to bring the Ark of God back to the sanctuary, back to Jerusalem. And so his question that he asks early in the psalm, when you come to me, sort of reflects that desire. He wants the Ark of the Covenant to be brought back to Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant had spent many years in the house of Abinadab, and then later, when they were trying to bring it back on a failed attempt, and that's of course where we have the death of two of those carrying the Ark in an improper way. The Ark then just stayed at the house of Obed-Edom. And so this psalm of dedication was probably written early in David's reign in Jerusalem. And so it is an account of what kind of leader David wants to be, what kind of leader he should be. Sort of spells out the essentials for successful leadership in the work of God. So let's just begin by reading the first couple of verses in Psalm 101, verses 1 and 2. David says, I will sing of your love and justice. To you, Lord, I will sing praise. I will be careful to lead a blameless life. When will you come to me? Now we have to remember that the king of Israel became God's representative on earth. In many ways, he was expected to rule the way God ruled, the way God commanded. And so the emphasis here begins with the heart. And we might say it starts with a devotion to God. The heart of the leader must be devoted to God. Certainly, we're thankful at Forest Mill to have leaders, our eldership, who, above all, are devoted to God. They are godly men seeking to do godly work in godly ways. And we are indeed thankful for that. But that is not always the case in every church. Not to single anybody out or point out the failings of any individual or congregation or church. But we know that sometimes men and women who seek power above anything else find themselves in positions of leadership, even in churches, and that's never a good situation. Those who want to wield power in order to lord it over others and force others to bend to their will are not the sort of leaders God is looking for. That is, in essence, devotion to self. What David says is important is devotion to God. It results, this sort of devotion to God results in a life lived blamelessly to the glory of God. Now, we see that word blameless, and immediately, if you're like me, you're thinking, oh, that means sinless, perfect. Nobody can blame me for anything. I haven't done anything wrong. But that's not really what this particular word means. Blameless is another word for integrity. For cultivating wholeness of heart and singleness of mind, instead of being split. Well, I'll do this good for now, and then I'll do something that I kind of want to do here in a little bit, or I'll do something that God wants me to do, and then I'll do something that I want me to do. That is a split heart or a divided heart. We're seeking the praise of God on one hand and the praise of men on the other. Seeking to do God's will, or seeking to gain fame and fortune and power or wealth or whatever it might be. That's a divided heart. And David's prayer was that he might be single-minded, single-hearted toward doing the will of God. Faith in living without scheming, we might say. That's how we walk the blameless way. And in order to do that, it takes a lot of soul searching, because sometimes we will tell ourselves on the surface that we're doing the right things for the right reasons. But when we dig a little deeper, when we look at our own hearts, we may discover that in fact we might have been doing some pretty good things for some pretty good reasons, or some good things that might have been for even selfish reasons. Or trying to do the wrong thing for the right reasons. None of those are blameless. We must seek to do the right things for God's reasons, to live with that singleness of heart. And so David vowed to live a godly life in his house. In other words, to have an administration that characterized mercy and justice and integrity. That's where true leadership, godly leadership, begins, with devotion to God. Now let's continue reading down at verses 3 through 5. I will not look with approval on anything that is vile. I hate what faithless people do. I will have no part in it. The perverse of heart shall be far from me. I will have nothing to do with what is evil. Whoever slanders their neighbor in secret, I will put to silence. Whoever has haughty eyes and a proud heart, I will not tolerate. David moved from the heart of the leader to the heart's, really the heart of the sinner, and the ability to tell the difference between the two. In other words, we might characterize these 3 verses as being about discernment, the ability to see what is right and wrong, and then to follow what is right. The heart and the eyes work together. You see that through this particular passage here. In other words, we will seek to lay eyes on what we love, right? I mean, that's true. If you think about the things that you love, we want to see what we love. So if we love our family, then nothing brings us greater joy than to see our family. If we love our possessions, then nothing would bring us greater joy than have all our possessions piled up in front of us. If we love lust, then nothing would please us more than something that brings lust. If we love wealth, then nothing would please us more than a show of opulence. Whatever we love, we want to see. I love the Tennessee Titans, or I love college football, right? Then we want to lay eyes on those things and go Titans on Sunday, right? We want to see what we love. And so David vows that his eyes are not going to be laid on anything that is untoward, that he is not going to look with approval on anything which God disapproves, which is, again, a sign of how devoted he was. This section kind of parallels Psalm 15, if you could think way back in Psalm 15, where David describes the ideal worshiper whom God welcomes into his dwelling. And basically, David is taking those characteristics and saying, that's what I want to be. David didn't want anyone in his cabinet, in his officials, to be not dedicated to God, to be not pursuing God, who's not walking with God. He wants to surround himself with a very different set of leaders than what we're seeing under the leadership of Saul. David is dedicated to having godly leaders around him. Set nothing worthless before my eyes is another way of saying, I don't want anything that's going to incite the lust of the eyes, is what 1 John 2:16 might put it. But it also means setting worthless goals, or setting out to achieve things that aren't really worthwhile, right? To say, well, my goals for 2021, my number one goal is to be better looking by the end of the year than I was at the beginning of the year. There's nothing wrong with having a healthy self-image or taking care of yourself. But if your goal is to be more attractive, well, that's a pretty worthless goal. If that's the whole product, not about feeling good about yourself, and not about taking care of yourself and being healthy, but it's just about looking good to other people, that's a worthless goal. If your goal is to accumulate solely for your own benefit, more wealth or more possessions, it's a worthless goal. If your goal is anything that is not worthwhile, it's a worthless thing. And to set that before your eyes and say, that's what I'm fixed on, that's what I'm going to pursue. David would say that is setting your heart on something that's not worthwhile, that's not good. Leaders have to set the best goals, guided by God's leadership and God's will, that benefit not just themselves, but those around them. And for leaders, in David's instance here, leading Israel, he has to set goals that will benefit the entire nation, not just the wealthy, or not just the poor, not just the those who are powerful, and not just those who are widows and orphans, but to benefit everyone, for righteousness to reign in the land. So that's what he's saying here. And so the leadership, a spiritual leader, not only sets the best goals, but he or she also uses the best methods to achieve those. So at the end of verse 3, he says, I hate what faithless people do. The faithless people are apostates, is one way, or people who have abandoned the way of God for their own way. In other words, I'm not going to work with or work towards the goals of people who aren't seeking God. So I'm not going to be a part of that faithless movement. I'm going to hate what faithless people do. So David had his eyes on the faithful of the land, not the faithless. And he also talks about a perverse heart, or a heart that's twisted. He says, I'm not going to tolerate that either. A perverse heart should be far from me. Surrounding yourself with godly people. And that's been a particularly difficult thing for many of us to do over the last year. Sometimes due to health concerns or for various reasons, many have found themselves largely confined at home and venturing out only on rare occasions. So how do you surround yourself with godly people when in so many ways you've become isolated? That's a difficult task. And certainly our leadership has tried to find ways with sharing our worship online and inviting everyone who is at home to join in and join with us. But it's difficult. Building relationships, whether it's on the phone or within your family or within the church, we need to make sure that we intentionally surround ourselves with godly people. So finally, let's look at verses 6 through 8 after we talked about discernment there. My eyes will be on the faithful of the land, that they may dwell with me. The one whose walk is blameless will minister to me. No one who practices deceit will dwell in my house. No one who speaks falsely will stand in my presence. Every morning I will put to silence all the wicked in the land. And I will cut off every evildoer from the city of the Lord. So we talked about devotion, and then we talked about discernment. This last section, we might say, is about decisiveness, or making right decisions. We've moved from the leader's heart to his eyes, and now we're looking at the will of the leader. This is what is going to happen. And then you have to find this repeated phrase, I will, I will, I will. Sort of give evidence to David's determination to serve God and God's people successfully, to be a man of decision that will benefit them all. David's not going to be one to make excuses. He's not going to be one to delay making decisions, delay doing the right thing. But some of those decisions are going to be difficult. And some of them are going to be even more difficult to implement after the decision is made. So it takes a steadfast, decisive heart to do that. Not one who is fickle and blown with the winds of popularity or acclaim. He has to be a person who decides what is right and then pursues it. That's one of the most difficult things about our country, is that because of a democracy, which in many ways benefits everyone, but it also often leaves us with leaders who are simply trying to do what everybody wants, populism. And if you're just trying to do what everybody wants, number one, there's never going to be anything that everybody wants. You're always going to be displeasing someone. But two, what if everybody wants to do the wrong thing? What do you do then? Well, if you're just trying to get reelected or trying to get elected, you go along. I'll do whatever you want. You become a slave to the will of the people, regardless of whether that will is good or not. But godly leadership is not dependent upon populism. Sometimes, in fact, David had to make decisions that were wildly unpopular. Even though he knew they were right, even though he knew it was the will of God, it must have been incredibly difficult. It is rare for us to find great men and women of faith willing to step out on that faith and make right decisions regardless of the consequences in our day and age. But that's what godly leadership takes. It takes someone who will act knowing what is the right thing to do, regardless of the outcome. David knew that no king could build a lasting government, a lasting leadership on lies or on deception. He wanted to be forthright, right? So he says, no one who practices deceit will dwell in my house. No one who speaks falsely will stand in my presence. It takes a determination to be that open, honest, forthright, not speaking one way to one group of people and one way to another. He wants people who will be open and honest all of the time surrounding him, and to be that sort of man himself. Now, Eastern kings in this particular age, they often administered their justice earlier in the mornings at the city gate. They would stand at the city gate. People would come before them with a problem, and they would say, well, this is what ought to be done. You owe this man this money, or you ought to repay this woman for the labor or the time, or whatever it might be. Or if you've been injured, or if someone has wronged you, then you come before the king, and he would administer justice. So David promised to hear those cases patiently, to consider them carefully, and to make his decision wisely. He vowed that God would punish offenders according to God's law, and that David would just sort of administer God's law, not deciding for himself what is right and what is wrong, and that he would silence the liars and expel the evildoers. Jerusalem was known as the city of God and the city of the great king, and the city that God loved most. So David is trying to live up to those expectations, that Jerusalem will be a place that people turn to for justice and righteousness. So we hear David's ideals. Was David successful in maintaining this high standard that he set forth in this psalm? Well, of course, not completely. Certainly, David had his faults, and those are always recorded for us so that we might see even godly men and women make unwise and ungodly decisions sometimes. No leader, apart from Jesus Christ, has ever maintained an unblemished record, and David is no exception. Now, there were times David failed his own family. His sin with Bathsheba not only failed his own family, he failed the nation, betrayed a friend and a comrade. He lied, he cheated, he stole another man's wife, and ultimately murdered to cover it up. He had problems with his generals, Joab and Abishai, and with his trusted counselor, Ahithophel. They all betrayed him, right? So David didn't always surround himself with the most godly and righteous people. But David reigned for 40 years, during which time he expanded the borders of the kingdom. He defeated Israel's enemies. He gathered wealth in the nation that was used later to build the temple. He wrote numerous psalms, and he established the dynasty that would eventually become the lineage of Jesus Christ. So all in all, despite his weaknesses, we can see that David's ideals led him down a good path. The task for us tonight is to do the same, to live up to the standards that David pointed out here in this psalm, to be the sort of people who are decisive, who are dedicated to God, and who are have the ability to to discern wisdom in the situations we encounter. Jerusalem eventually becomes known as the city of David. Jesus is called the Son of David. Could there be any higher compliment than those? May we live up to the standards God has set forth in His Word. I pray that you will find some time tonight or later in this week to meditate on what is one of my very, very favorite songs, because it's so practical and it cuts me right to my core every time I read it, Psalm 101. Well, may God bless you in the study of His Word this evening.